Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my review of the Sigma 17-40 f1.8 DC Art, a bright aperture, high quality, general purpose zoom for mirrorless cameras with cropped APS-C sensors. Announced in June 2025 and costing around £780, dollar price and description, the 17-40 1.8 is available in Sony E, Fujifilm X, Leica L, and, wait for it, Canon RF mounts. Fingers crossed for Nikon Z in the future. Since it's still a novelty to have brand new third-party lenses for Canon RF, I'm going to be reviewing that version here on an EOS R7 body, although my results will apply to the other versions, albeit with a fractionally different crop factor. Canon's APS-C bodies, like the EOS R7, R10, R50 and R100, all apply a 1.6 times field reduction, delivering an equivalent range for this lens of around 27.2 to 64mm. That's versus the slightly milder 1.5 times crop of everyone else, where the range becomes a little bit wider at around 25.5 to 60mm. Either way, it's a general purpose range that takes you from wide angle to just beyond standard coverage, but what makes it really special is the f1.8 aperture, which in full frame equivalence terms for depth of field is roughly similar to f2.8. In fact, if you're happy with f1.8, it could replace, say, 3 of Sigma's own APS-C primes, such as the 16, the 23 and the 30mm. While the range and aperture makes for a pretty unique combination on APS-C, Sigma does have past form with this kind of specification. Most obviously the much loved 18-35 1.8 DC Art for DSLRs with APS-C sensors, which was launched in 2013. When that lens came out, it cost around $800 or £650. This older model measured 78mm in diameter, 122mm long, weighed 810 grams, pretty hefty, and took 72mm filters. Adapt it to a mirrorless camera and it'll become a little longer and heavier still. If you're interested, you can pick up a used version of the EF mount version for about £450 today. In contrast, the new 17-40 1.8 may share the same aperture, but slightly extends the range at both ends, while also managing to be smaller and noticeably lighter. It's narrower at 73mm in diameter, shorter at 160mm in length, and weighs around 2/3 the amount at 535 grams, while also taking smaller and more affordable 67mm filters. In terms of design, it shares similar proportions, being quite long and thin. As a member of Sigma's Art series, the build quality is excellent, sealed against dust and splashes, including a rubber grommet at the mount. Like all of Sigma's cameras and lenses, it's made in their Aizu factory in Japan. Closest to the lens mount on the Canon RF version is a free-spinning, unlabeled, clicky control ring, which can be assigned to a number of functions, including exposure compensation, white balance or ISO. It could also adjust the aperture. Interestingly though, the other versions of this lens swap this control ring for a dedicated aperture ring, which can be clicked or declicked or locked in the A position for body-based control. I personally prefer this over an unlabeled free spinning ring, but Sigma's approach for the RF version is more in line with Canon's own system and strategy, so it does make sense for that mount. Next comes the zoom ring with quite a short throw between 17 and 40mm. Importantly, the barrel does not extend while zooming, with the adjustment being entirely internal. Between the zoom and focusing rings are a pair of custom buttons and a switch for auto or manual focus. Note there is no optical stabilization in this lens, so no need for a control to switch that on or off. At the end of the lens is a free spinning manual focusing ring that turns smoothly and feels nicely damped, and as noted earlier, the filter thread measures 67mm. Sigma also includes a petal lens hood, which twists onto the bayonet and is released with a locking button. Okay, now for my tests, all made with a Canon EOS R7 body, and since the lens is designed to be used with profiles, that's how I'm evaluating it. These are applied automatically for JPEGs, but if you shoot in RAW, you will need to apply them, or you're going to see barrel distortion and more obvious vignetting, especially at the wide end. The profile is milder at the longer end of the range, just if you're interested. Let's start with a single autofocus performance, here using a central area on the EOS R7 and the lens at 17mm 1.8. Here the focusing is quick and decisive. And next at 40mm 1.8, where the conditions are of course more demanding, but the body and lens combination still quickly and easily pull focus from near to far and back again. Here's the same test but for video, starting at 17mm 1.8, where the body's default settings perform quite a leisurely but still smooth focusing pull. And now at 40mm 1.8, where again the focus pull can be smooth. The motors are essentially silent, in operation. Now for a continuous autofocus test using the whole frame with face detection enabled, first at 17mm 1.8, where you can see how well the lens works for things like environmental portraits and presentations. It's a useful lens for capturing plenty of the surroundings while still enjoying some separation. Zoom the lens to 40mm, still at f1.8 of course, and you'll enjoy a tighter view with greater opportunity for a blurred background. Here we're now at a slightly longer than standard focal length, so you're getting a more flattering perspective. Great for close range portraits or small groups. How about focus breathing? Here's the lens at 17mm f16, manually focusing from infinity to the closest distance and back again. As you focus closer, the field of view widens a little, almost like you're zooming to a slightly wider focal length. And now at 40mm f16, again focusing from infinity to the closest distance and back again, but this time the breathing has become almost non-existent. Next for the optical quality, starting with my distant landscape test, and the view angled as always so that details run right into the far corners. This was taken at 17mm 1.8. Taking a closer look in the middle of the image shows a decent degree of detail from the get-go. As I gradually close the aperture, there's a fractional boost in crispness, but I'd say it's already looking pretty good, wide open in the middle of the frame. So let's now return to the 1.8 sample and head into the far corner to see how that performs. Here there's a very mild reduction in sharpness and some darkening due to vignetting, but both are kept pretty well under control. As I gradually close the aperture, there's mild boosts in sharpness to be gained, with the details becoming crisper by f2.8. Next for the lens roughly midway through the range at 28mm, starting as always wide open at f1.8. Taking a closer look in the middle of the frame again shows a high degree of detail right out of the gate. As I gradually stop down, there's some very minor improvements to contrast, but again this lens is performing very well when wide open. So let's return to the f1.8 sample before heading into the far corners. Here there's some minor softening, but that's more about pixel peeping here than an actual practical complaint. Again, as I gradually close the aperture, there's small gains to be had in ultimate sharpness, with the image becoming nice and crisp by about f5.6, but again it's still very good at the larger apertures. And finally, at the long end of the range, here at 40mm 1.8. Taking a closer look in the middle shows a decent degree of detail right out of the gate once again. Good news for anyone shooting portraits or details at this focal length. Stopping down brings very mild boost to the contrast and overall crispness, but to be honest, it's already performing very well wide open at f1.8. So let's return to that sample and now head into the far corner. Here you can see the detail is pretty much maintained, and while there is a little bit of darkening due to vignetting, the profile is keeping it fairly well under control. The quality is looking good here, and as I gradually stop down the aperture, you'll see minor improvements to the contrast and sharpness, but again is already performing very well wide open. Okay, now for a portrait test at 40mm 1.8, where the lens becomes equivalent to something between standard and short telephoto in full frame terms. Again, it's a nice length for closer range portrait work or small groups, and it's possible to enjoy some reasonable separation from the background at f1.8. Taking a closer look shows a high degree of detail around my eyes and nice smooth rendering of the background behind me. Now it's not going to be a bokeh monster, but it's not far from what you'd get with a good 50mm 1.8 on an APS-C body. For a more formal test of background blur, it's time for my bokeh ball test, first at 40mm 1.8 and close to the minimum focusing distance. Here the bokeh balls are large and pretty well behaved with minimal outlining or onion ring textures. Closing the aperture a tad to f2 makes virtually no difference, so here's how it looks at f2.8, where the blobs have become less elongated and more uniform across the frame, while also avoiding the shape of the diaphragm system. At f4 onwards they're almost all the same shape, and there's now more evidence of the 11-bladed diaphragm system, but the rounded blades still stay mostly out of the way. And now for the same scene at 17mm 1.8, and even at this wider focal length you can see how you can still enjoy some nice bokeh blobs in the background. Again, they're pretty well behaved with minimal outlining or onion ringing. As the aperture is stopped down, they also manage to mostly avoid the shape of the diaphragm system. At the other end of the aperture, here's how diffraction spikes look at the minimum value of f16 when pointed directly at the sun. And if you're interested in flare, here's the lens again pointing at the sun and panning across, and this time with the aperture close to f11. And finally, for my APS-C test, a couple of macro shots taken at the closest focusing distance. Note the ruler in these examples was tilting a little bit away, but I'm focused on and measuring the top edge. So first at 17mm f4, where the lens captured 144mm across the frame, and next at 40mm f4, where the lens captured 92mm across the frame. Just before wrapping up, even though this lens is designed for cropped APS-C sensors, you may be wondering how it performs on a full frame body. Is it possible to make a milder crop than 1.5 or 1.6 times, for instance? So here's the lens at 17mm on the left with a full frame sensor, and on the right with Canon's 1.6 times APS-C crop. I captured these images with an EOS R8 body, and since APS-C lenses force it into a 1.6 times crop mode, I had to actually slightly detach the lens in order to capture the whole frame. Now this in turn has disabled focusing, and it's also left the aperture wide open, so it's not going to be a practical option on Canon bodies, but it could be interesting for the Sony and L-mount owners out there. I'll now overlay a frame where the outer edge indicates Canon's 1.6 times crop, and this shows how much is actually usable outside the frame. And now for the milder 1.5 times crop of other APS-C systems. And out of curiosity, here's a 1.3 times crop in the 16:9 shape to represent the dynamic steady shot video mode on the latest Sony cameras, proving that you could just about use this lens on a full frame body with the strongest stabilization mode taking care of those unusable portions of the frame. Okay, now for my final verdict, during which I'll show you more photos taken with the lens on an EOS R7 body. The Sigma 17-40 1.8 DC Art is one of the best quality zooms ever made for APS-C mirrorless cameras, and available across a wide range of mounts including Sony E, Fujifilm X, Leica L and even Canon RF. Having already delighted APS-C owners with their 10-18 and 18-50 2.8 zooms, Sigma could have easily rested on its laurels, but instead took on the challenge of improving its legendary 18-35 1.8 zoom for APS-C DSLRs. The result is a native mirrorless lens with a broader zoom range, faster and quieter focusing, and better overall quality, all packed into a weather-sealed barrel that's narrower, shorter, and 1/3 lighter than before. In my tests, it was sharp across the frame and throughout the range, with the aperture wide open. Meanwhile, that bright aperture can deliver well-behaved bokeh with attractive rendering. The physical design is excellent, with dust and splash resistance, and either a control ring for the Canon owners or a dedicated aperture ring for the other versions. Indeed, it's hard to actually find fault with it apart from the barrel being quite long, but then the size is reasonable given it could viably replace several prime lenses. Price-wise, it's not going to be the cheapest lens around. Obviously, it's quite a high-end option, and it is interesting to compare it to Panasonic's recent 24-60 2.8, a zoom with a similar range and depth of field for full-frame bodies, and that lens only costs a little bit more. But that kind of comparison is just academic if you own a different system, plus Sigma's lens is a member of its higher-end art series with more attractive rendering, at least in my tests. Ultimately, if you own an APS-C body and always like the idea of a lens that's roughly delivering similar results to a high-end 24-60 2.8 on full frame, then your prayers have now been answered. At a time when many APS-C systems are neglected and treated as lower-end options, Sigma proves it's possible to create a truly high-end, aspirational lens that makes the most of this cropped format. Whether it's right for you or not, this is the lens that APS-C bodies have been crying out for. And that's it for this lens review. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, and if you found it useful at all, I'd really appreciate if you consider giving it a like on my channel or follow. It really does help. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.